But tonight we're talking about Thomas Becket's Martyrdom, which is, I don't know, maybe a little bit of an obscure topic these days, but for a whole long time it was a very celebrated tale, in England at least. So, we've quoted this a couple times, and I know that, yeah, exactly. I know that you maybe even know it by heart, right? And so, okay. All right. So this is one of the things that I had to learn anyway when I was in junior high, was the Middle English prologue to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So it goes, Wandad April with his shore Zota, the dracht de March and perste to the Rota, and badet every vein in swish liqueur, of which vertu engendered is the fleur. When Zephyrus eke with his sveta breath, in spirit hath in every holt and heth, the tendre cropis and the younger sonna hath in the ram hath cours yerunna, and smalle fowlers making melodia, that slepen all nicht with open ear. You can maybe understand it better when you're reading it than when I'm trying to say it, right? So, I mean, when in April with its sweet showers, when April showers bring May flowers, right? The dryness of March had pierced to the root and bathed every sap vessel with such sap of which empowers, flowers are engendered. So April showers are bringing May flowers. When Zephyrus, the west wind, with his sweet breath, has inspired in everybody's, in every holt and heth, the tender buds and the young sun, just to say the sun in the sky. The sun has now, in the ram, Aries, so this is the time period. If you happen to be born in April like I am, and the beginning of April, then you know that you're in Aries, and so that's how that works. It's half cours Urana, so it's gone half through Aries now that April has arrived. Then the little birds are making melodies, and they're sleeping all night with open eyes. So pricketh hem natur in here courages, then longen folk to goen on pilgrimages, and palmers for to saken stranja strandes, to fernaholes, couth in sundre landes, and specially from every sheeres ende of England to Canterbury they wende, the holy blissful martyr for to sake that hem hath holpen wan they were to sake. Which is to say, so people, are pricked in their hearts to want to go on pilgrimage, and pilgrims then are going to seek strange lands in sundry lands, and especially from every shire of England, they go to Canterbury because of the holy blissful martyr, which, as we are going to be saying, is Thomas of Becket, right? So Thomas of Canterbury, and that's essentially what the whole idea of the Canterbury Tales are. They're all the pilgrims want to go and visit the martyr's shrine, so that they are able to. Probably, one of the goals is to be healed from some kind of infirmity that they have, or also to be forgiven for some penance or sin that they've done. And essentially, it's also, in addition to being an actual physical healing, it's actually also a ritual for social ritual healing. So if you are essentially you're in the doghouse from something you've done in the village or something like that, you do this big public penance of doing this thing, and you can come back and be welcomed back into society, is how a pilgrimage works. So the Shrine of Becket in Canterbury Cathedral, and this continues to exist its day. It's a common enough event that people would do so it could be a trope already by Chaucer's age, which is several centuries after the martyrdom, in order to be a trope or literary device. And it continues to be talked about. So when I was a teenager, one of my very favorite movies was Beckett. It's adapted actually from a 1959 play. It was originally written in French, called Becket or the Honor of God. So then when I went to college, as often happens, you have all these fantasies that in childhood dreams, like, oh, this is so important, it's so wonderful, and it's so meaningful to me, this movie. And my Latin professor said, oh yeah, well, it's a wonderful movie, except for it's completely and historically inaccurate. I'm like, what? What's inaccurate? I was very indignant that any part of this movie would be considered inaccurate by my professor, but it turns out, unfortunately, it's good movie, not good history. And so we'll talk a little bit about it if this is the way you've approached this story before. The story is very compelling, and so it's actually inspired several plays, a long line of plays. So Alfred Lord Tennyson has a play called Becket. T.S. Eliot has a play about it called Murder in the Cathedral. The one that we have, Jean Anil here, who is the one that the movie's made from, Becket or the Honor of God. And very recently, there, I guess, has been a play by Paul Webb called Four Nights in Knaresborough, which is about the aftermath of the four knights that kill Becket, and what essentially is called like the worst career move you could make for a knight. And so we'll look at this real quickly for people's review. I don't know if you've seen the movie or how many of you have seen the movie. It's worth watching. If you haven't seen it, you can rent it. It's a good movie to go back and watch. As told in the 1964 film, it's the story of Henry II and Thomas Becket. Henry II played by Peter O'Toole, and Richard Burton plays Becket. It's about an extraordinary relationship, and in fact it's called, Henry is actually multiple occasions in the movie declares his love for his friend Becket. Between two friends who are also very powerful political leaders, they become separated because they end up having political interests that are different from each other, which causes mistrust, and ultimately this is a power battle between crown, king, and church, the Archbishop of Canterbury being the head of the church in England. The perceived betrayals that they have are irreconcilable, and they ultimately lead to the murder. Spoiler, this is a spoiler, for you if you've seen the movie. Murder of Becket by Henry's knights. So at the very beginning of the movie anyway, Henry appoints Becket Chancellor of England, and Chancellor is like the Chancellor of Germany. At the as an example, they don't have a I think they might still have a Chancellor, but anyway, it's not as important in England anymore. It's like Prime Minister, almost. The chief court advisor at the time. As the king's man then, Becket ably serves the king. And so as chancellor at the outset, Henry is having a quarrel with the church, and Becket steps up and immediately starts providing legal arguments actually forceful arguments in order to coerce the church prelates. Essentially, the church is tax exempt, but Henry needs money. That's what the crown often does for war. And so Archbishop Tybalt points out that his great-grandfather, William the Conqueror, had granted all of these exemptions to the church. And so Henry's like, well, he rest in peace where he is. He doesn't need taxes, but I'm here on earth and I still do. So I'm passing around the plate and
Is that Gielgud as Theobald?
Gielgud? I don't know who it is. I don't know the actor. But he's good. I like him in the role. He's convincing. He does a good job. Okay, so from there, the war in France, so England across the Channel, Normandy, Henry's Duke of Normandy, and Paris here, the King of France. So Becket uses the tax money that they get from the church to capture border cities in Normandy from King Louis without having any bloodshed. So essentially they hire a bunch of mercenaries, they put in a big show, and then they bribe everybody in the town, and they come back over to the Norman or English side without having bloodshed in the movie. So while in Normandy then, Henry receives word that Tybalt has died and decides, he gets the real bright idea, he's going to appoint Thomas Becket as the new archbishop. If Canterbury is for the king, what can stop him, right? So he'll have his own man running the church. So Becket's enthroned as Archbishop of Canterbury, and what ends up being the case in the movie, and to some extent also in real life, the king has unwittingly introduced his friend, who had been quite loyal to him, to higher loyalties, the honor of God. He's now not only just serving crown, he also has to have a relationship with God and serve God on earth. So from that moment, right at the start of his administration as Archbishop, Becket's loyalties are divided, but they're kind of immediately tested. One of the characters, I forget this guy's name too as an actor, but he's a great actor, and he plays Gilbert Folliot, who is actually a major character in the history of this. So he is an important churchman. The bishopric of London being one of the main other important bishoprics. So Canterbury is the primate of England, the leading archbishopric. York is the second archbishopric, but then the most wealthy bishoprics after that are Winchester, Durham, and London. And so, anyway, London being right there at the capital, next to Winchester. Anyway, so Gilbert Folliot comes and complains to Thomas Becket that one of Henry's barons has killed a priest who he had seized for trial. So the priest had been accused of adultery, but rather than actually even trying him, they've just kind of killed him without due process, according to the movie anyway, version of his accounts. And then rather than giving him to the church courts, which is what the church claims should have happened, right? So essentially a priest who has been accused of this kind of a crime, what he's supposed to be doing is that the knights are supposed to hand him over to the bishop's court, and the bishops will try the guy according to church law. So Bishop Folliot demands that Becket, as Archbishop of the Church, defend the liberties of the Church so that this doesn't introduce a precedent, because obviously, in English law, having precedents is a big deal, and so you don't want to have a precedent that would eliminate the rights of privilege of clergy. So Becket is then faced with this idea: as the king's chancellor, is he going to be essentially the bought man, like Henry in the movie is wanting him to be, or is he, as archbishop, then going to take his first loyalty to the church? And he chooses the church. So in a kind of an amazing scene, Becket excommunicates Henry's baron, and he also resigns as Chancellor of England. And so they have this amazing scene with all of these monks, and they all have these giant candles, and Becket is holding the candle, and he's declaring the baron excommunicate and anathema, and consigning him to hell with all the devil and his fallen angels and reprobate. Anyway, and he turns it over the candle and stumps it like that way, and then drops it on the ground. And then all the monks simultaneously say, "So be it," and they all do it. So it's a very serious excommunication anyway. So what ends up happening then is that, slide here, I don't have a slide. So Henry then decides he's going to fight fire with fire. So if Becket is going to use the powers of the church, he uses the power of the state. He charges Becket with misadministration of funds while he was chancellor, and asks him to produce all his receipts. And so essentially, Becket is about to be charged in the King's Court. Hi. But as Robert de Moment, the justicer, is trying to read the charges out, Becket keeps on stopping him and telling him, essentially yelling at him as he is his spiritual father, that he forbids any judgment to be passed on him, and indeed he forbids anybody of laying any of the charges on pain of excommunication, so they'll all get excommunicated too. And instead he says that he's going to appeal his case directly to the Pope in Rome. So, yes.
Thanks. I got a little lost there. Okay, was it the bishop that was charged with adultery was assassinated, was killed? And
yeah.
So who's on which side? Does Becket want the church to do what they want, or does Becket want the church to be held back by the law and not do things like that?
Oh yeah, thanks for you. I'm sorry if I probably went really quite fast there. So there was a regular priest who's accused of adultery.
Adultery? Was he married?
Adultery. The woman was was married. Presumably, it's the movie. They're calling it adultery.
Oh.
They're calling him an adulterous priest. Yeah, I agree with you. So, but on the other hand, it's completely possible still at this point for priests to be married. It's not allowed. So there's church canons against it, but it was still they're still in the middle. The church is still in the middle of the process of stamping out the practice.
Apparently in Italy there was tussle going on about the issue too.
Yeah, so the comment is that this is also still going on in Italy, and that's the case. So essentially all of the when we're looking at any of this kind of stuff in terms of these canons, that we've already had the schism with the Greek Church, and so all of this is what's going on in the Latin Church. And so, like you say, what's happening in Italy, which is where the Pope usually is, is kind of the same as what's happening in England or Germany or Spain or any the Christian part of Spain. And so, as a result of that, the Reformed papacy has been, for the last century or so, promulgating new church canons and forbidding priests to marry. But it takes a whole long time to actually get them to stop doing it. And in fact, they mostly only succeed in getting them to stop formally marrying ultimately, because then they'll have essentially common law mistresses that are still like living in the parishes or the abbeys and essentially creating unmarried families with illegitimate children then. And so unfortunately it doesn't quite work. I mean, some of the priests obviously don't marry, and some of them maybe don't like women. But then some of them are just not interested in women or whatever. So anyway, but like you say, whether it's an adultery, which is to say the formal sin in a Christian or Jewish sense is that you can only commit adultery if you're married, and otherwise it would be fornication, which would be sexual relations with somebody who you're not married to, if you're not married. So, so we were answering the other point though. So the idea of it is the priest, has been arrested by a baron and charged. But he should be, and the next stage according to church custom, and according to custom is, that the priest should be given over to the church courts. But instead of having that happen, he was killed by the barons. And so to your point, Rudy, Becket then takes the king, doesn't take the king's side. In other words, he goes against what the king and the barons are doing, and takes the church's side and excommunicates the baron, which makes the king really angry. So the king may well have been willing to make some kind of a compromise with him, because he wasn't really necessarily wanting the baron to go and kill adulterous priests or not, out of rule of law. But once Becket elevates it up to this level where he excommunicates the king's baron, then he's kind of like laying down the law, and so the king doesn't have necessarily that much choice in his response. Elizabeth.
Yeah, just not everybody in the 21st century knows that there were two systems of law. There was the secular, which was the king's law, and there was the church's law. And if you were a priest or could read, you got benefit of clergy, which meant that you went before the church's courts, which were much more lenient than the king's courts.
Right. And these literally were that system, which then lasts in England for centuries, is literally only getting established right now. So those precedents are only right now being sewn into, because of this story with Henry and Becket, they're being sewn into English common law and precedent. And in fact, Henry is really at the beginning of the establishment of English common law. So he actually compiles it, he writes it all down, he kind of sets up the courts that are doing that. It was only with William the Conqueror, so Henry's great-grandfather, that was the first time church courts were actually established in England. So under the previous Anglo-Saxon kingdom, they were following kind of the older precedent where there weren't any separate church courts. But it's a new thing that has kind of started emerging where exactly as Elizabeth describes it, there are parallel courts, and people are concerned that the church courts, people are getting off easy in the church courts, and that the church courts are slow, and that the church courts allow infinite appeals. Because as soon as you are having your case tried before the church court, then you can appeal it up to the bishop, then up to the pope, and now it suddenly becomes very onerous if you're, let's say, a relatively poor person who can't travel all the way to Rome to have your court case settled. A person can potentially go to the pope, get a dispensation or something like that, and so it ends up being very problematic for people. So it has started to become an abuse, and so this is kind of what the story is about. All that complexity does not exist in the movie. So anyway, we'll get to some of that, but anyway, right now in terms of the movie, they don't explain a lot of that. But essentially the idea of it is that Becket and the king are now at odds, right? So Becket appeals his case to the Pope, rather than face the king's court. And he flees then from England into exile across the channel into France, where King Louis, all the kings of France are always Louis, right? So King Louis VII is only too happy to receive Becket as the enemy of his enemy, Henry II. So Henry, as we even just saw earlier in the movie, they're having war with France, right, to take back some of the towns on the Norman borders, and Louis is very happy to then return the favor and stick it to Henry by aiding and abetting his recalcitrant archbishop. Becket, though, doesn't stay in France. He runs off to Rome to visit the Pope, in the movie anyway. The cardinals, who are all around the Pope, have all already received letters from the king, and they want to take all the money that the king is offering in order to depose Becket, so they are very happy to do that. The Pope, however, believes that if he were to depose Becket and turn everything over to the king, that would involve the church's kind of capitulation and surrender to the state. And so he instead decides that rather than siding with either one, he's going to allow Becket to go into exile and live in a monastery in France, and to let everybody cool off, and hopefully they can come to some kind of a compromise eventually. I like the Italian cardinal here. Oh, here. We need to wait for the mic.
Thank you. If the Pope said that Henry could live in exile, did he have a stipulated time, or did he say, well, when Henry II dies?
Yeah, there's no time frame on it.
No
it's essentially in the movie, he's just like, I'm just going to send you away to a monastic retreat to let everybody cool off, and we don't know how long it's going to be. And to your point, it ends up starting to drag on for years. So in the history, it's 6 years, and so it ends up being a very long time, and you don't know when it's ever going to end. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So. Okay. Eventually, Henry agrees to allow Becket to return to England. So after those 6 years, the King of France sets up a meeting on the beach, and they're able to meet one-on-one. Although they're not truly reconciled, Henry eventually agrees to allow him to return to England in order to end the political part of the dispute anyway, and so he goes. But as Becket crosses back to England, Henry goes back to his knights and things like that, and he is still upset, he's still grieving, he still hasn't gotten satisfaction, and so at a certain point at the end of the drinking party, he says, in the movie anyway, will no one rid me of this troublesome priest? Are there no men left in England? How do I have to, how long am I going to have to put up with this guy? And you can see all those guys are getting the point, right? So those 4 guys then sneak out of the court, and then they go by separate ways. They meet up across the channel. They go to Canterbury, where they confront Becket. While Becket is at Vespers in the cathedral. Becket is actually aware that they're there and had the capacity to escape, but says essentially that he's not running anymore, and this is his, that he's going to continue to do his job as the spiritual father of England, and so he does Vespers. And so the knights confront him and then murder him in front of the altar, and then in the movie his last words are, "Poor Henry," because of the results that he foresees will happen.
No, they should have said, is this the end of Becket? Like, is this the end of Rico?
Is this the end of Becket? Yeah. But he says poor Henry in the movie.
Stupid Henry?
Well, the thing about it is they've been best friends. So even though they've had this big fight, Henry has very much, when he's saying that, all those things, he's saying how much Becket is the only person he's ever loved in his entire life. In other words, this is his friend who betrayed him, and he would trade everybody for... to renew the friendship if it were possible, and he's just so angry that he's been betrayed this way. And so Becket, in the same way, although doesn't express the friendship the same degree in the same way in the movie as Henry does, he nevertheless is worried for his friend in terms of how this ended, right? Okay, so then in the movie what ends up happening is that the movie concludes with Henry doing public penance. And so even though he's a king, in this case, he goes to Becket's tomb, where he allows himself to be scourged by monks who are administering a public penance for him. So it's sort of like what we talked about in terms of this pilgrimage. It's already a first pilgrimage. He goes to Canterbury for that kind of a pilgrimage to doing that same exact thing we talked about, which is a public ritual healing so that you can now be welcomed back into society. And while he's doing that afterwards, when he's explaining to all the knights who were involved in the murder, he's saying, we'll have to now seek out, the Archbishop's murderers. It's a time for all of us to do, to do justice. And there's like saying, well, sire, their whereabouts are unknown, and he's like,
Yeah, right.
and like, well, we're going to figure it out, guys, and so that's quite ominous for those poor knights. So anyway, just to recount then, that was the movie, and so maybe sometime you'll watch it. It's a great movie, but how about the history behind the movie, right? Joe,
So
one sec.
Were the knights killed? Were they?
Not in the movie.
Oh, in actual.
Well, we'll get to real life now. So the question was, are the knights killed? In the movie, it's just left ominously what happens to them. I'll tell you about real life. So in real life, what ends up happening is that they have to also, they ultimately have to do a penance of going on crusade and serving as knights in the Holy Land for like 18 years or something each. And so it seems like that's pretty generous, in terms of being let off in that way. But anyway, so they go on crusade and they go to the Holy Land. And I don't actually know how many of them survive the whole time and make it back or anything like that, but that's what happens. Okay, so what are some of the inaccuracies that exist in the play and movie? So a huge one that it just exists throughout the whole screenplay is there's this subplot about Normans versus Saxons as sort of an ethnic or maybe nationalist or maybe racist subplot. And so the movie Becket, character Becket, is reviled by both the Norman lords and the Norman bishops alike. The bishops call him a Saxon gutter snipe, all of these kind of things. And then Saxons, including this character here of Brother John, say that you're a traitor to your race because you're a collaborator with the Normans. And so there's a very strong undercurrent of kind of Normans versus Saxons in the movie. However, the historical Thomas Becket was absolutely a Norman. So it's, so even the knights, when they're about to kill him at the end, they're like saying, Saxon, but it doesn't. Anyway, he's not a Saxon. His father, Gilbert Becket, who's the Sheriff of London, was the son of a knight from Normandy. His mother, Matilda, is also of Norman descent, so he's Norman on both sides. So where does this come from? So what I'd suggest is that this kind of very confused biases, are kind of coming from the 19th and especially 20th centuries, where we're imposing our more present day or last century's nationalist or racist ideas on the past. And so one of the complexities for Europeans who were trying to come up with say racial identity stories or pure stories, if you're the English, how do you decide what to do? With this kind of you have this kind of Anglo-Saxon past, but you also have this whole thing about the Normans, and how do you decide how do you tell this story? And so when you kind of decide, well, as the English, we're the Anglo-Saxons, and so the Normans were like French invaders, it becomes a very weird story because in so many ways England is a real mix or a merger between the two cultures. We know from English how our present day English has got so much, has so changed Old English. We read Middle English there. Middle English is already 200 years or 300 years into the Norman addition of words of Norman French, and so we can kind of understand that Middle English. If we were to go back and I was to do one of these with Beowulf on it, you wouldn't get it at all, or I don't get it. Maybe you do, but anyway, so it's very, very different. And so it's kind of complicated to do that. And the same thing is happening for the French, in the 20th century. So they would tell these stories too, and it's kind of hard to decide, okay, are we going to root for the Gauls? Or do we root for the people called French, the Franks? So when the Franks come in and conquer Gaul, is that bad for our kind of national purity story, or is it because the Franks, who are this Germanic people who we take our name from, French, are we rooting for them? And so anyway, I just think that these kind of national identity stories are quite confused because in fact, there is no such thing as an Anglo-Saxon race, despite what people thought in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The English people are a big mix of, the Autochthonic people that were there before the Celts came, the Celts, the Romans, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, the Norse, the Danes, the Normans and more. So anyway, it's always been a big mix. Anglo-Saxon is already a combined word. We can already see that by saying Anglo-Saxon it's like saying Czechoslovak. I mean, it's not one people. And although there is a case that the Norman nobles largely replaced the indigenous Anglo-Saxon nobles after 1066, so after the conquest, this is not entirely, it's not like they went through and the Normans just killed everybody off or anything like that. What they did, lots of Anglo-Saxon nobles died at the actual Battle of Hastings with Harold. But what ended up happening was that because the Normans didn't seem totally secure, many of the old lords took part in different rebellions over the next 20 years or so with William the Conqueror, and as a result, their network got put down largely. And so as a result, there really were very much fewer Anglo-Saxon nobles anyway, although, again, the women were married in, and in the church, Anglo-Saxon bishops continued to be in power until they got replaced, when they would die off. So, that's one of the things then, this whole Saxon, Norman/Saxon ethnic subplot. Another one that is really crazy in the movie is the way that Henry just totally ignores and resents his mother in the movie. So, I mean, his mother at some point says, well, I suppose I've given you nothing. And he's just like, life. Yes, thank you. That's all she gave him. And he's like, after that, you just constantly shuffled me off into... like at court, you just gave me to a nanny or whatever it would be. So in other words, she got absolutely nothing from her as far as the movie character is concerned. But actually, we know very well from the lecture we had before, if you were with us, when we talked about Empress Matilda, who is Henry's mother. Henry owed a lot to his mother and actually very much valued her counsel. So Empress Matilda, as we saw, was in some ways the first reigning Queen of England, although it was only for a few weeks and she wasn't able to make good her claim because the usurper Stephen of Blois was able to successfully kind of take control of the apparatus of the state, but it caused a whole period of time throughout his reign anyway of anarchy, and ultimately she was more or less able to take control of Normandy and the continent and the parts of the area around Wales and not in England. So yeah, there's a question here.
Thank you. I thought the rule at that time was that only male heirs could inherit the throne. So was the fact that she was the only child of Henry I, or what's the situation there?
Yeah.
Only surviving.
Yep. So the answer was she's the only surviving child. Her brother, William Adelin, was the heir. He died in this tragedy of the White Ship, and so all of the young Norman nobles, including him, they got in a big drinking party and they sank their ship and they all drowned. And so as a result of that, she was the heir. So she got called back from Germany. She was a widow from the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor. She came back, and the king had everybody swear that she would be the heir, and that they would all uphold her right to the throne.
Yeah, swear their allegiance to her.
That's right, swear allegiance to her. But what ended up happening was that they all decided, when Stephen came across the channel and quickly did a quick usurpation, they were all like, okay, that sounds good. And so he's, again, a nephew. So they were able to, but it's again his by right of his sister, William the Conqueror's sister. It's his son, and so it goes through a woman either way. So your question about can only sons succeed? There was no precedent yet. And we don't have the law at this point. And so ultimately in France, they decide that you can only have male descent, and you can only have your only right to the throne is through male descent, and they call that Salic law. In England, they decide against this ultimately. So in other words, in England, they ultimately decide that women can inherit if there's no boys, And now, of course, doesn't matter if there's boys. But that's only very recently, right? So anyway, that's what happened. So thanks. Elizabeth.
Yeah, Stephen, they were cousins, him and Matilda, but
Yes.
Stephen was kind of wound up on the throne, but he didn't have any surviving sons, and it
Right.
was Matilda's son who took power after him.
He had a surviving son, but his heir died.
Oh.
Eustace, his son Eustace. So Stephen had been Count of Boulogne. His father-in-law's name was Eustace, and so that's a family name. He originally had no more ambition than to be Count of Boulogne, and so he named his son Eustace. But then when Eustace they wanted to crown him king in his own lifetime, and so that this crown would be secure. Instead, Eustace died, and when that happened, the whole fight went out of Stephen. And so he agreed, like you say, that Henry would be the heir. And so and then Stephen then died quite soon after that. And so then Henry was able to succeed peacefully. But so anyway, Matilda then. Henry was called Fitz-Empress. In other words, his mother was so important that his mother is more important than his father. So he's son of the Empress. And she was a trusted counselor all his life. In fact, Matilda advised Henry not to appoint, and this is in history again, not in the movie. In the movie, he doesn't listen to her, but he advised her against appointing Becket as Archbishop, actually. And later then, during the whole long 6-year fight, she would advise against extreme ideas that Henry might have. And so instead tried to compromise and reconcile them. Yes, question?
Was Matilda called, was she empress because she was married to the Holy Roman Emperor?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So she had been married as a young girl to the Holy Roman Emperor, and so that's why she's called Empress. Although, in fact, she was never actually crowned Empress. So her husband, who had been crowned Emperor, ended up dying young, and so the way the rules of the Holy Roman Empire work. Until you're crowned by the Pope in Rome as Emperor and Empress, your title is King. You get elected by the German nobles, and you're called King of the Romans, which means the Germans, But in any event, so King of the Romans, and so her technical title in Germany was Queen of the Romans. And so, because the imperial court was very strict about that kind of thing, they always write Matilda, Regina Romanii or whatever, and so, but when she got back to England, she just went by Empress, and she signed it always she always decided, Imperatrix Matilda, and that kind of thing. So she was very proud of that title, and like I say, Henry ended up getting called Fitz-Empress, okay, Matilda. So, just to look at the history of this, we've done this before a little bit, but so in addition to England, which Henry inherits then from his mother Matilda, in the movie, Henry describes himself as an old resident because again, they're trying to establish this kind of Norman Saxon story in the movie. Since he's the great grandson of William the Conqueror, it's true he's a Norman, and a great grandson of William the Conqueror on his mother's side, but on his father's side, he is an Angevin, which is to say he's from this county here, Anjou, and in fact he was actually born in Maine, in Le Mans, which is one of the counties that's owned by his dad, Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, Geoffrey Plantagenet. So he owns Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. And so that's what he gets from his dad. He gets Normandy and England from his mom. And then he gets all this from his wife. And so the King of France, by the way, owns this directly and technically is king of all this, but he's not even allowed to go into this kind of land. So they essentially, to deal with the Normans, so he's king of the Normandy as well, but the King of France is only allowed to go here to the border, and then they have parleys with the dukes at the border. So so Henry has a lot more power within at least this part of his domain, right to here, but less up here. Elizabeth.
His wife was Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was a powerhouse, and this has nothing to do with anything, but you won't remember this, but older residents of Toronto will remember Sam the Record Man.
Yeah.
His wife's name was Eleanor, and she established a record company that was called Aquitaine.
Oh, there you go.
She was a powerhouse too.
Yeah. Yeah, so Eleanor of Aquitaine ends up being, like you say, a very important figure, and we'll talk about her right now. So, as I say, the rest of Henry's vast empire, the Duchy of Aquitaine, which includes Poitou, Auvergne, Gascony, and this claim even to Toulouse. So it's not colored in because they didn't actually ever get it. But the Aquitanian duke claimed all of that as their realm. were the lands of his wife, the redoubtable Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was the richest heiress in Europe. So she inherited, to the point before, the question before about whether women could inherit. According to southern French law, Aquitanian law, women could inherit, and did. And so as the surviving child of the last Duke, William X of Aquitaine, she inherited it all. She then, initially as a young girl, was married to Louis VII, who we talked about, and at that point, then Louis suddenly had lots of land and lots of power potentially. The only problem is that he absolutely couldn't get along with Eleanor. They went on crusade together, and didn't go well. She might have flirted with her uncle. We don't know, but whatever it is, they didn't get along.
I don't think he was interested in women.
Louis?
Excuse me, I have two questions. First of all, how old was Eleanor when she was married to Louis VII, and how old was he? And secondly, what part of France does William the Conqueror come from?
So I'll do the second answer first. William the Conqueror is from Normandy.
Right.
And so that's why Henry inherited from his mother, who is the granddaughter of William the Conqueror, Normandy and England. In terms of the exact age of Eleanor and Louis, they're both young people. I don't remember how old they were.
Well, they probably were in the old days. You're 4 years old, and the other one's 7 years old. That was automatically they were.
But they were closer to being of age. So sometimes, like you say, sometimes there's a betrothal period where you might even marry off. For kings and queens, you might even marry them off like very young, like 4 or something like that.
Like Victoria.
Or that kind of thing. But they don't actually then consummate the marriage. So Matilda got married to the Holy Roman Emperor before she was an adult. They sent her off to Germany, and it took her a long time before she became an adult, and they consummated the marriage and that kind of a thing. In this case, Eleanor and Louis were, like teenagers or young 20s or something like that when they got together. And Eleanor had several daughters by Louis. But they then annulled the marriage, so it's as if it didn't count.
Oh, thank you.
Yep. Okay. However, in the movie, and this is, I think, the worst historical travesty of the movie, because we've already talked about what an important character Eleanor of Aquitaine is, right? And so in the movie, rather than have Eleanor of Aquitaine, there's an unnamed queen of Henry, so they don't even say that her name is Eleanor, and her character is really portrayed as being completely useless, carping, whiny. She's there to be insanely jealous of Becket, Henry's love for Becket, and she's therefore quite the opposite of the historical Eleanor, who, as we mentioned, or as Elizabeth mentioned, is a powerhouse, right? And so she's in the movie, and it's completely crazy.
So who wrote the screenplay?
The person who wrote the screenplay got the best Oscar for best screenplay. Do you know the answer? I don't know who it is. Yeah, but the play had these inaccuracies in it, and the playwright acknowledged that. So, what?
It's an American movie.
It's so the question is it an American movie? It's a French play. The French play went on to be staged in London, and then it was an American/English movie production. Many of these where they have famous English actors, but then it's like an American company. Paramount put the movie out. Okay, so the movie's Henry then only has a love for Becket. When the Queen says she's given Henry everything, her youth, her children, he says, "I don't like my children," and then he continues, your body was an empty desert, madam, which duty forced me to wander in alone." So it's a great line for the story of Henry's unrequited love for Becket in the movie, but the real history differs a lot. So Henry and Eleanor seem to have been had a pretty. It's a political marriage on the one hand, but on the other hand, to begin with, no, it goes up and down. But at the beginning, they seem quite excited for each other. Okay, so we'll just mention then. There's a movie 4 years later, which also stars Peter O'Toole as the same king, Henry II, and includes Eleanor of Aquitaine, starring Katharine Hepburn, actually playing herself. And so this is, as opposed to this other queen from the movie Becket. And so anyway, it's actually a better movie. It's a really good movie. The other movie's good, but this is a much better movie, and then historically, it's a lot better. And in a lot of ways, that this captures the personalities of the historical figures a lot more closely. Okay, so even with a good story, history is often better than fiction. So obviously, the fact that this story keeps getting retold, I think it makes it a compelling story. So when we have this idea of a great friendship that's torn apart by, just your diverging political interests, so the different things that you're obliged to do in your life, there's a perceived betrayal by your friend, the inability for either you or your friend to have any kind of a compromise, to reconcile, and ultimately it ends here in murder, leaving to Henry in horrible grief, but also not wholly innocent of this crime, because he is actually saying things like, are there, no men left in England, this kind of thing, so kind of inciting what ends up happening. So Becket was murdered in terms of the history in December of 1170. He's canonized as a saint by Pope Alexander less than 3 years later, actually lives a little over 2 years later, and achieved huge fame and martyrdom. So if you're aware of how Catholic Church long it takes in terms of martyrs, even really popular, in terms of saints, even really popular people, sometimes you have to wait.
Mother Teresa.
Yeah, Mother Teresa. She's, obviously fast-tracked Mother Teresa, but it still didn't happen in 2 years, So it takes a lot longer than that for the process normally. In this particular case, it went like that. I was going to say here then that although history is sometimes stranger than fiction and it's often better than fiction, history is always more complex than fiction. And so I want to just lift the hood up here and just look at a little more of the depth behind this story. So the historical Thomas Becket, we mentioned before, he's a Norman, not a Saxon. He's born around 1120 in London. He was educated as a cleric. He obtained a position in the household of Tybalt of Bec, the Archbishop of Canterbury. So ends up being a rising star in clerical circles that allows him to then have a position with the Archbishop himself. And in that household then he excelled. And in 1154, Tybalt makes him Archdeacon of Canterbury. So this is a very important clerical benefice that is beneath the Archbishop, right? And so apparently, so he is good, all the people who go to universities and things like that and cathedral schools are clerics. That's what it meant back then, but he is not necessarily Becket isn't trained in philosophy or theology, but is in more practical stuff. But ends up being able to excel then at these kind of roles. So, although depicted as enemies in the movie, so we saw back when we were doing the summary of the movie that Henry was shouting down Tybalt here, who didn't want to pay taxes, because he wanted the church exemptions and things like that. In fact, King Henry and Tybalt had a very close working relationship that involved all sorts of compromises on both sides. So, since so much law was customary, a lot of times if one party was more aggrieved than the other, the church or the state, on any particular issue, they would be able to do a kind of a workaround, and there was a lot of give and take possible with a kind of seasoned older politician like Tybalt of Bec. In fact, actually, as opposed to the way it's portrayed in the movie, where Henry wants to just make his friend kind of arbitrarily into the office of Chancellor, actually it's Tybalt who wanted to have his own man. That's kind of ironic for how the movie goes, right? Because the movie is that Henry wants to have his man be Archbishop of Canterbury. Tybalt wanted to have his man, his Archdeacon of Canterbury, at court, and he is the one who advised the king to appoint Becket to the office of Chancellor. So that way he'd have his own man at the highest height of the royal court. However, the historical Becket quickly transferred his loyalty to the king, which is what does happen in the movie, the other way around, right? And it led Tybalt to complain that his Archdeacon gave thought to him no more. And so he wasn't actually able to continue to influence Becket once he was in the king's service. Nevertheless, relations between crown and church continued to be relatively harmonious in this time period. Another problem with the movie's depiction is, although Henry is really depicted as very weak in the movie Becket, he's actually among England's most energetic and successful kings. Henry was born in 1133 in Maine, I mentioned, in Le Mans, and it was during that civil war between his mother and King Stephen. So in the course of that fighting, Henry was able to, with his parents, conquer Normandy and succeed Stephen as Duke of Normandy at 17. He inherited Anjou at 18 when his dad unexpectedly died. Shortly after, he married Eleanor and, of course, brought in that whole southern part of the kingdom to his realm. And he himself then, after Stephen passed away, is crowned King of England at age 21 in 1154. So it was a very rapid rise for an energetic young man. Coming to the throne then after this period, which was called by contemporaries the Anarchy, which is to say the civil war when Stephen was not able to actually exercise royal authority and had to, generally speaking, trade it away to the powerful nobles and the powerful churchmen in order to even get the support that he had. Henry II's then primary goals for England were to end all the local warfare. So essentially, when there is no royal control, local barons just pillage each other and they attack each other and nobody can stop them because they can't actually, there's no mechanism for them to settle disputes among the different lords unless there's a powerful king that can tell them stop doing that or you'll get your lands confiscated. And so as a result, there's just all of these endemic private wars that Henry wants to put a stop to and therefore extend royal peace, royal justice, restore all of the crown's lost rights, lost lands. So in his words or his ideas for this, so that everything can be restored back to the way it was in the days of good King Henry, my grandfather. And so essentially almost anything that had happened in English common law and precedent or even exchange or loss of lands and things like that, there was an automatic kind of rollback thing in King Henry II's court where you could say, you have to give me the charters from back when King Henry I was around. And so in a lot of ways it's flexible and there was compromise, but essentially there was a let's roll the clock back now and everything that Stephen did, and by the way, everything my mom did, isn't going to count. So you might have become super rich during this time period, but you're not necessarily going to be confirmed in that.
But it was only 20 years before.
It was only 20 years, but a lot can happen in 20 years. And did, yeah. So Henry was quite successful then in bringing order to a country that was super tired of war. So England was absolutely exhausted. When Stephen came across, so King Henry I had been a very strong king and had exercised a lot of power over his barons. And the barons, when Stephen came across and said, hey, I'll be your king, they might have thought, hey, this is a deal. Because we'll have this weak guy and we'll get to do whatever we want. But it turns out actually that it's not that fun. So anyway, let's just talk just a little bit of background here. So Henry's relationship with the church. Medieval law is primarily oral and customary. So as I say, Henry expected to have to enjoy the same kind of rights, customs, obligations, and also for him to do the same duties and things that his grandfather had done. So his primary goal with the church is the same as his goal with all of the barons, the nobility, which is to restore order and recover regalian rights. So if all kinds of things and benefits have been given off to the church or lands or let's say even precedents about benefit of clergy and this kind of thing, he wants to roll that back to the way it was under King Henry I. For the English crown, there were a bunch of customary rights under Henry I that included the right, for example, to nominate bishops and abbots. This is past the investiture controversy, but the deal, though, is that essentially the king gets to, they have an election, but the king can have nominated ahead of time. The election can take place in the king's presence, and then after the person's nominated and is consecrated bishop, then they still have to be given their lands by the king, the bishoprics' lands with the staff. And so anyway, so it's a technical compromise where before, it had been way more possible, for example, for the kings to sell offices and that kind of thing. And so the church has gotten that much reform through, but it's still these officials, the bishops and archbishops, are such important royal officials that the kings have to control those, and they do. They also have this right to seize episcopal revenues during vacancies, which seems crazy, but anyway, essentially when the bishop dies and there's no bishop, the king immediately sends all his officers in and they collect all of the bishop's rents and dues and everything like that. And so they get all that money flows into the royal treasury. And in fact, with Henry's great uncle, William II, William Rufus, who actually really was very antagonistic to the clergy and had a much, as opposed to Henry, he let the bishops all die and did not replace them, you know. And it was only when he was on his sick bed and he really thought he was going to die, and they were all convinced him that he made an oath that he'd actually name Anselm of Beck Archbishop of Canterbury. And then he recovered, and then he really regretted that he did it. And then Anselm became the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he had to fight with him for the rest of his life, and Anselm had to go into exile. Anyway, so generally speaking, then, if you wanted to, you leave all the abbots and bishoprics unfilled, and then all the revenue goes into the royal coffers. That's one of the rights, a traditional right. There are also the rights of the English crown to forbid bishops, archbishops, abbots from leaving England without permission. And why is that important? Because they might go to the Pope, right? And so you can't go to the Pope the English bishops without permission can't go to a church council that the Pope's having, where he can tell them all kinds of new rules and laws and things like that might upset the king. And you also can't appeal court cases that the king doesn't want unless he gives you permission to go do that. That's one of the traditional rights.
Skype.
Yeah, there's no Skype. So you can write letters to the Pope, but for all the good that does you, right, if you can't leave, right? And there's also, they also forbid the Pope from sending legates, which is to say powerful cardinals that have papal authority. They're not allowed to go to England without the king's permission. And then finally, there's an understanding that the bishops will not excommunicate the king's chief vassals without royal permission. So if a baron has done something or other that allows him to be excommunicated, you still have to get permission from the king to do it. Okay, so those are traditional rights. You can imagine that all of those aren't particularly what the kind of rights or whatever the laws in canon law that the popes are promulgating at their church councils simultaneously, right? But these are customary laws. So there is now, though, a new theory of law that is happening at the same time in the centuries before Becket. And so in the past century and a half before, the church had been developing a new theory of canon law based on the recovery of Roman law. So popes from Gregory VII, so this is the guy for the Gregorian reform who it's named for, promulgated new canons at church councils that are based on Roman law. And these oppose customs, so these are new novelties. Yes. Valerie.
I'm assuming that what was customary law was loosely based on German customary law, and did that not lead to our common law eventually?
Yeah, so
because that's based on precedent and all that.
Yep. So yeah, so essentially all of the customary law that's in England at this point are the traditional practices, as far back as anybody can remember. And in a lot of cases, that only lasts so long, especially when you've had like this massive decapitation that happened in the conquest, right? And so whatever the customs that got transferred across immediately after 1066, and then those are remembered a generation, 4 generations later to Henry's day. And then, like you say, then what happened before that, the Anglo-Saxon times going all the way back to early Anglo-Saxon settlements, so many, many centuries before that, then that has its roots, before, where the Angles and Saxons and the Jutes come from Germany. And so in German common law and that kind of a thing, it's not common law yet. But it's right at this moment with Henry II that essentially is the foundation of how common law and common law precedent work. So it really is kind of being systematized because Henry has done this good job of taking kind of a lawless country in anarchy and going around and doing inquiries, finding out what are the customs. You go around and ask everybody what they all are. And then essentially you set up shire courts, you get all the courts going again, you improve justice with all kinds of different ways of writs work. And that's almost the foundation of common law as it's been inherited to this day. So exactly, as you say. Okay, but simultaneously, while England's doing that, while Henry's kind of bequeathing that, the other thing that's happening, so continental law is quite different. So because it's having this basis of Roman law, right? And that's also what's happening in the church on the continent. So we talked about this already. So we talked about benefit of clergy. So on the church's side of customary law, one of the rights has included benefit of clergy, which is to say the right of clerics to be tried in ecclesiastical courts, although as of Henry I's time, this wasn't fully established about precisely which cases would go or whether it's universal. So some of the canons are essentially, if you're a clerk, then you get to be tried in ecclesiastical court no matter what it is. But for a whole bunch of different kinds of cases, let's say cases involving land, the royal courts would want to try those cases, right? So we mentioned this already, where we said benefit of clergy could lead to abuses when a cleric is tried for a civil case like murder. So that would be the biggest kind of an abuse. Essentially, if a priest murdered a knight and then claimed benefit of clergy, goes to the church court, not only could there be all kinds of delays and how long justice could take and appeals and appeals and appeals, but also if it was actually did get to come to a conclusion, so a lot of times church court can't punish anybody with death, so it can't do capital offenses. It actually can't do corporal capital offenses the way a royal court would. Royal court, they just kill you real fast. But in the church courts, you can't. And so a church court, what they can do is they can hand you over to the secular court and have you hung or whatever. But it might be just as likely that what they'll do is decide that being defrocked is punishment enough, because now you're no longer a cleric, you're a layman. And so from a clerical perspective, that's really quite terrible. But so being degraded out of holy orders and made into a regular layperson. But for people who were regular lay people who are getting murdered, they're like, well, wait a second. So this guy gets to free and clear and he gets to go kill somebody else before we can actually now try him for being a murderer? And so obviously this was a complexity in terms of abuse that was being argued out at the time. So, and going back to Henry now, that's a little bit background on law. So according to his contemporaries, Henry had no interest in royal trappings. So we showed like that map of how he's lord of everywhere from the Pyrenees up to Scotland. Nevertheless, he generally dressed, as contemporaries would say, you can't actually tell him from one of his huntsmen. So he was always dressed in hunting clothes and he's around hunting, and he's spending all of his time energetically moving his court, which is this is a word here, peripatetic, which means to say the court isn't like the court of the King of France, which is always in Paris, but rather it goes everywhere. And he only spent a certain amount of time in England. He's spending a lot of time in Normandy. He's spending a lot of time in Aquitaine. The court moves all around. And if you actually want to appeal to the king's court, you have to kind of figure out where they are. And you might not know, because Henry was also very active. He might tell people, we're moving tomorrow, and they would have to go. Okay. In contrast, Becket, however, made just like this crazy, massive show of his wealth once he became chancellor. So, just as an example, so this is before he's an archbishop, when he's just chancellor, and this is the historical Becket. In 1158, Becket is sent on an embassy to the King of France. He goes to Paris, and he has the spectacular coterie that includes 250 singing footmen, hounds and greyhounds on leashes with trainers, 8 great wagons guarded by chained mastiffs, led by 5 great chargers. The chargers each have monkeys on their back. Real monkeys they had. Anyway, they followed by 28 pack horses carrying gold and silver plate, clothes, money, books, followed by 200 members of the chancellor's retinue, squires carrying the shields in front of mounted knights, falconers with hawks, and then lesser servants riding 2 by 2, until finally it gets all the way back to Becket, who's the person who rides into Paris. And so the Parisians declared, what a magnificent man the King of England must be if his chancellor travels in such great state. And so I'm reminded of the movie from Aladdin, where when Aladdin is showing up as Prince Ali and he has 60 elephants, llamas galore, is all the different kind of coterie that you bring. That's how you make a big show. And so that kind of shows kind of the difference between Becket's and Henry's character and attitudes anyway towards wealth and show. When Henry then nominates Becket for the archbishopric, although it's portrayed in the movie as a plot to have a yes man in charge of the church, that doesn't seem to be borne out. So his nomination of Becket actually seemed aimed at continuing the relationship that he'd had with Tybalt. So Tybalt had been, Becket had been Tybalt's archdeacon and still was archdeacon of Canterbury. Tybalt had recommended Becket for the chancellor's role. Now it makes sense as Henry's position to nominate Becket to replace Tybalt. So Henry didn't actually have, so if we were like assuming that he has this kind of plot where he's trying to take over the church and this kind of thing, he nominated a bunch of bishops before this on his continental domains and also in England. He doesn't have any kind of pattern. So a lot of times he would just appoint churchmen that have a lot of high esteem. Sometimes he'd appoint clerks, but anyway, there wasn't a pattern. However his goals might have been, Becket may, though, have been worried that he was perceived as a yes man. And we don't know that for sure, but we can just say based on the kinds of things that he did, that may be how we understand what he did. So soon after he was ordained archbishop, Becket made a bunch of strong moves to declare his independence from the king. So including he resigned as chancellor, so he gave the Lions of England back to the king. This took Henry completely by surprise. He probably presumed that he would be able to be like the Holy Roman Emperor, who often had, let's say, the Archbishop of Cologne might be the chancellor. It was quite common for the archbishop to be a chancellor in Germany. And so that was shocking to him. And then also he excommunicated one of Henry's barons over not a murder like is in the movie, but it's just over a feudal dispute. So whatever Becket's motives were in doing that, Henry then, the historical Henry, read the actions as personal betrayal, and he decided that he couldn't trust his former friend. So he lost faith that Becket would adhere to all that customary law that we've been talking about. So custom works if everybody kind of agrees to what the customs are. But we just saw how, for example, one of the customs was that you can't excommunicate a baron without permission of the king, and Becket did that, right? And so the king then took an extraordinary action of writing down all of the oral law of the realm and demanding that the bishops swear an oath to uphold those customs. Valerie, do you have a question? Yeah.
I'm just wondering if Becket's motivation might have been that, was it not the case that this was within a context and a background of the rising power of kings and the representation by the king of the independence of their realm, and that vis-a-vis the greater overarching imperial, let's call it, a power of the church. In the past, the kings, I think they were creatures of the secular emperor, but they were starting to become not absolute, but let's say independent in their own right. From increasingly independent from the church, that this was kind of like a tug of war that was going on. Was that within that context already, or is that too early? And I'm wondering if he might have been, he probably was aware of these power politics in the larger sense, and so he's decided maybe to take a strong stand.
Yeah. What I'll say is a little complicated, as a response is what I would say, is that in terms of the different kings, of the realms outside of the Holy Roman Empire. So the kings of France, the kings of England, Scotland, the kings in the Spanish kingdoms were largely wholly independent of any other authority. So in a certain sense, Henry has to do fealty to the king of France for all of that land that he owned. But in a certain sense, the king of France had almost no power over him whatsoever. And so in a de facto sense, both Henry and going all the way back for centuries, the kings have been largely totally independent. So the whole church state as one combined thing had kind of been functioning in the West under Charlemagne. But as Charlemagne's empire broke down, the authority of the church fell actually upon the local leaders, kind of. And it is, like you say, in the context, like we were talking about Gregorian reform, what had been happening in the last century is not that the kings were taking more power from the church, but rather that the papacy was asserting to have more control over all of the different local bishoprics. And so Becket wanted to have his personal quarrel with Henry definitely being seen as a big picture church versus state thing, and he did everything in his power to kind of maximize that. But it wasn't always clear that that was the case, as we'll see. So in the meantime, though, one of the things the king is doing here before it actually blows up into full conflict between them is, like I say, he doesn't think that he can trust Becket in terms of upholding customary law. He writes all the customs down, and while they're at a court at Clarendon Palace, He has all the bishops there and all the barons. He brings them out the things, the customs as he's written them out, and he orders them to immediately swear that they'll uphold the customs of the realm as now written down. And so these become then what's called the Constitutions and Clarendons at Clarendon. So it's because it was at this court at Clarendon Palace. And while they're largely an accurate rendition of English custom up until that point, the idea that they were then written down, it was not customary. So in other words, oral law is something that is not supposed to be written down or hadn't customarily been written down. And also imposing an oath. So in other words, saying you must now have an oath to this written document is also not a custom. And so in those cases, those actually are novelties, and novelty is bad in the Middle Ages, right? So essentially these are novelties, and what the result of this actually is, when you take an oral tradition and you write it all down, that tends to make law very inflexible. So one of the things that happens with oral tradition is, as time goes on, you can actually, things that aren't relevant anymore fall out often of the oral tradition, and new precedents kind of get emerged and things like that. But once you write a thing down, that's not as possible anymore. So at this then, faced with this decision or this, what do you call it? Anyway, ultimatum by the king, Becket would only swear to the constitutions if he could add the clause, saving my order. So I will obey all these customs, saving my order. And all of the bishops stood firm in backing him against the fury of the king. So the king, though, more or less thought, boy, if you add that clause, saving my order, that means you could pretty much drive a truck. They don't have trucks, but anyway, you could drive a lot of things through that, that hole, because all you could say is, well, my order forbids me from doing this custom or whatever, right? So nevertheless, in the middle of the whole thing, Becket does something that's quite confusing, and the sources really don't understand why he did, but he suddenly changed his course. He didn't explain it to any of his bishops why. He swore the oath and told the bishops, or ordered the bishops to do likewise. Then they all scattered and he fled. And when he did, he then absolved himself of the oath and absolved all of them of the oath. And so the problem there was then it made it so the king, again, doesn't think he can trust him, right? So, as in the movie, Henry's response is to charge Becket in the royal courts with mishandling of his funds as chancellor, and Becket's response is to appeal to the Pope, which, as we've seen, is against the custom because you can't appeal to the Pope without permission according to the custom, and to leave England in exile without permission, which again is against the customs, right? And then now against the written customs. Just as in the movie, Louis VII is, all too happy to accept Becket in exile. But we actually see now, with additional context, as we've now seen, that Louis is not an equal player with Henry. So Louis is substantially poorer and less powerful than Henry, and so he has to do any little way he can to kind of jab at Henry, and this is certainly one of the ways he tries to do it. He's also, by the way, really mad at this guy because he did annul his wife away, but then Henry, married her, took all these lands, and then had a bazillion sons, right? So then she'd only given him daughters, and now suddenly, he has, 5 sons by her. Anyway, tough for Louis. Okay, anyway. So the historical Pope Alexander, they didn't have to go to Rome to find him because he's also in exile in France, so it's much more convenient. So he's fighting with the emperor, which is often true in the Middle Ages of the popes and emperors. So Frederick Barbarossa is the emperor at the time. Barbarossa has installed his own anti-pope in Rome, and the anti-popes often take the name Victor for some reason. It's not a good name to pick because it makes you an anti-pope. But anyway, they're hopeful anyway, optimistic that they'll be victorious. But anyway, Pope Victor IV is the anti-pope in Rome. And so the politics are really, really complicated because Alexander needs both Louis and Henry's support, even though Henry and Louis are enemies. So Alexander is a much more shrewd politician than Becket. Becket hopes that his fight with Henry II is going to go that same way as this famous fight that Pope Gregory VII, the Gregorian Reform, had with his emperor at the time, where the Emperor Henry IV had been humbled by the Pope, And the only way he could get out of that was by appearing in sackcloth and kneeling before the Pope for 4 days at Canossa, and ultimately, the message is actually completely wrong in a way for what Becket would want, because actually Henry IV ends up defeating Gregory by doing that, because he ends up having a political solution that allows him to get back in good graces and recapture all of his authority and all this kind of thing. But Becket isn't really thinking, I think, politically like that. He's thinking about having Henry humbled and do that for him. And I think that's what he would like. So Alexander understands then that this fights of the investiture controversy, that the big fights of the past century were over, and he treated, unlike what Becket wanted, Henry's and Becket's conflict as more personal and therefore open to pragmatic compromise. And so ultimately, that goes back and forth and all the different exegeses of that, and there's a whole bunch of more episodes where Becket will again try to only take oaths by saving my order, saving the honor of God. There's another one, attempted reconciliation, where Henry won't give Becket the kiss of peace at the end of it, because he says he had sworn an oath that he'd never give him the kiss of peace. And so anyway, multiple times it continuously falls apart until finally, after 6 years of exile, Louis, who has now made an alliance with Henry, has betrothed his daughter to Henry's son, brokers a peace treaty then between Henry and Becket, which allows the Archbishop to return home. But the dispute between them continues to be unresolved because neither side is willing to admit error or defeat. They both kind of declare victory, and then nothing happens. Becket goes home. Whether or not Henry said the exact words that he's famous for, he said something or other. He definitely didn't intend to have the knights go off and do that, because he'd said all kinds of hasty things about Becket for the past 6-8 years. But in any event, he admitted enough guilt to this that he ended up later doing public penance. So he's aware that he said something. We don't know for sure if it's, will no one rid me of this troublesome priest. The knights don't appear to have understood what really the issues were. These particular 4 knights aren't bright knights. Based on the words we have from when they don't have a plan. They go meet Becket, they have a little meeting with him, they yell weird, crazy things at him, they go away, they don't, because he shouts them down. They're not sure what they do, they kind of regroup, they arm themselves, they go in at Vespers. Again, they shout at him some kind of things that mean that they don't really understand what the dispute was actually about. He responds, and he responds in a way that makes them mad enough they kill him. And so that's kind of what ends up happening with the martyrdom. So the martyrdom then caused an international scandal. The Pope was only really appeased in this because of this degree in the historical Henry actually showed in terms of his personal grief. So he was completely distraught at this news. In fact, at a certain point, they thought they would lose both of them. He thought he might actually die of, illness was easy back then. The king ultimately avoided excommunication, and Henry's relationship with the church under Becket's successors then generally returned to the way that things had been under Tybalt of Bec. Right? So historically then, although Becket's martyrdom really had almost no consequences in the relationship between crown and state, which had largely already been worked out in the preceding generations, the battles had already been settled, but the actual history has had just as little effect on Becket's legend. In death, the sainted Archbishop's story has lived on as a martyr for the liberty of church, and that has only increased and increased and increased. And that is Becket's martyrdom. Good question. Thanks.